Welcome to another session of Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn group. I am over the moon excited about our session today. We've got the legendary Bryan Pena on the show to talk about the topic of holding clients and stakeholders accountable. And it's a super important topic. Well, Bryan, I'm once again so excited to have you. And your background is nothing short of legendary. And I was going to act like our friend David Letterman and say, this gentleman needs no introduction, but I'll still do it. Bryan has been a buyer of contingent workforce services. Many of us all know that him from his time leading the contingent workforce strategies and solutions group at Staffing Industry Analysts and growing it exponentially. Now he heads up Defiant Solutions that consults with enterprise clients and vendors on optimizing their contingent workforce programs, as well as go-to-market strategies. So Bryan, I'm so excited to have you coming from your brand new studio in California. What are some of the things you've learned in your travels as an instructor, as a buyer, as a consultant and an analyst in the industry in keeping clients and stakeholders accountable? And why is it important?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I think it's an important conversation to have is a lot of suppliers and a lot of supplier relationships fall down because it's often one direction. It's perceived as one direction. So what does that mean? That means that, like, as a buying organization, you think that just by virtue of being a customer, you should deserve the best price, service, the whole 9 yards. The unfortunate fact is, if you want to get the best service, the best pricing, you need to be the best client. And so now that's never more important than it is right now, when we hear so much conversation about fluctuating levels of demand and the driving kind of really significant impetus for managing and controlling and reducing costs. The way to do that is to take a good hard look at what you're doing as a stakeholder and as a buying organization, and how are you negatively impacting the overall profitability and ability of your supplier partners to work with your program. A great example of that, a really simple example, is something as simple as volume forecasts. The metaphor that I always use is the $100 million RFP that becomes the $10 million implementation after 6 months, where that maybe get $1 million of throughput, right? Those sorts of things are the things that actually cost you so much money in executing your program as a program owner. And so what I've always done is I've always done a really deep dive into the requirements of the stakeholder client, as well as having a deep understanding of how sure they are that the volume or the services they're expecting to procure are actually going to be what's eventually required to be delivered. So often that is not the case, where at the beginning of the relationship looks very different than day one of the contract execution, right? So I think that, now more than ever, understanding that you have a role to play in delivering those cost savings, not just from haggling, but really looking at yourself and trying to understand exactly what you're doing that affects supplier cost. And that's why I think it's super important now more than ever.
Yeah, you touched on it being very much a two-way street, right?
Very much a two-way street, yeah, absolutely.
And so if the organization comes from, and the buyers come from the perspective of, hey, bow to me, you're not going to probably get the best suppliers as part of your program, right? And so
100%. I think one of the things that is a true sign of supplier maturity is the ability to say no. Is the ability to say no to what's an unrealistic request and be willing to walk away, which is really your only true last option, is to say no to the deal. I can tell you from my personal experience, when I first started out in procurement, my job as I see it is to keep on asking unrealistic requests until I get to the third no, or I get to the point where the final request is not, you get to that point where it really starts to negatively impact the relationship. And what I found was I was astonished by how much leeway I would get from suppliers and clients alike as a negotiator for supplier side, just by asking for it, not understanding or not really going into it, but just simply asking because you're supposed to ask. Saying no oftentimes is the best thing you do for a relationship. Just like I would say to my 13-year-old daughter, she wants to get a motorcycle, the answer is going to be no, because we're trying to do what's best for the relationship long term, right?
Yeah.
Supplier relationships, like any relationship, is no different. Healthy boundaries, healthy understanding about what's expected of the other one, that's required to be successful. And supplier relationships are no different than any other kind, built on healthy boundaries and mutual respect, and mutual respect for what the other objective or the other party's dealing with.
Yeah, and you talked about the maturity of suppliers, and some of the most mature suppliers are the ones that say no to clients, right?
100%. They're the ones that know exactly where they fit, what they do well, and what they don't do. And that's a key level of professional awareness, and making sure that you really are able to deliver on your promises, because all it takes is one bad implementation to really negatively impact a whole company. All it takes is one negative implementation to affect a career, and so being able to do that, and understanding the power that you have as a supplier when a program manager picks you. I always like to give this speech about how when I would pick a supplier, I was going to be their greatest cheerleader. It was my job to sell them internally. My job was to be an extension of their solution team, sell them successfully internally. And my job, my ability to feed my family, pay my rent, keep my car in the driveway, is predicated on you as a supplier doing what you say you're going to do.
Yeah.
So if I have an unrealistic request, or I ask for something that's not going to be delivered, that's going to affect negatively on me in the long term. Not just because I want it and I have to go back and try and find a way to navigate away from something, but if it fails, if the program fails, I'm going to lose my job and I have a hard time getting another one. So really, being obsessed with making sure that you arm your suppliers with all of the right information and all that they need to be successful is critical. And now, one of the things that is an interesting standpoint that's very different than when you and I first started in this industry many years ago, is that there are people who have graduated from college and fallen into the seat of a program manager, which is fantastic, right? I think it's a fantastic evolution of our space. It's professionalized. It's a role unto itself. It's a career path now. But the downside of that is you have people who go into these roles who have never successfully implemented them. They've never successfully deployed a program. They've never deployed a global program. They've never deployed a VMS. They've never done anything. So what they're doing is they're very successful at managing, but when it comes time to make a change, they don't understand the depth to which you have to gather requirements or find or negotiate with a supplier. It just becomes a conversation without a clear set of requirements and deployment path and execution and program goals and all that other stuff that you would have in a normal process. A lot of times that's missing. And so it results in a very, I don't want to say sloppy implementation, but certainly a messy implementation experience. So as a buyer, as an enterprise, as a supplier, you are being compensated to come with the tribal knowledge of those successful deployments.
Yeah.
And since you're the one who knows, it's up to you to make sure that all of your questions are answered. All the data elements for a successful program are addressed, and all of the stakeholders are properly educated. So I think that this is a great time to really retrench and take a look at your holistic approach as a company, for sure, but really taking a good look at what you're doing as an enterprise to understand how are you driving up costs and how can you mitigate those effects for the long term. And that's often the best way to reduce it. It's often much more constructive than simply asking for blanket price reductions in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the things that a lot of suppliers today have difficulty with is hurting the relationship with the client, right? And they don't want to lose the deal by saying no, or
Yes.
Specifically in a highly competitive environment that often there's a lineup of suppliers looking for the work and working and the deals. Yeah. So if that supplier says no, they have this fear that the person behind them will just take their spot. So, how can you hold your clients accountable in saying no and or directing them in a way that you feel will lead to a mutually beneficial success without hurting that relationship and losing the deal?
Well, there's a couple of things that I think you should do. One is understand and this always surprises me that a lot of companies can't do this, is understand the relative profitability of every client. Okay, so you understand exactly how much it costs. And we work with a number of companies to do this, to determine what is the cost and what is the profitability of client X. Understanding the consequence, what's it take to support them? How do they perform relative to others? How is the program grown? What's the growth path for that client? So having a deep understanding of those particular clients is something that I think should start with day one, right? So you really understand the parameters of profitability, the parameters of delivery, how you can affect service up or down based on your ability to execute that. The next step, I would imagine, is to understand when there's a request that comes across that's unreasonable. Why is it unreasonable? And what makes it unreasonable? Is it too much service? Is it not aligned with your core strength? Is it something you don't do well? It's going to drive costs way up. It's going to really deviate from some elements of delivery. Understanding what that is, and then understanding why you're saying no, being very clear in what that is, and then also coming with alternatives. Yeah. Right? There's nothing worse than just saying no. But we can achieve that goal, whatever that goal is, if Mr. Client, by following option 1, option 2, option 3, or option 4. So instead of just saying a blanket no, you want to find a way to be constructive and demonstrate a willingness to work, as opposed to just simply saying no. I recognize that sometimes it's going to say no. No is no. And just like any relationship, the only real outcome or positive, I don't say affirmative relief, to take a legal term, is to walk away. And sometimes that's not the best thing you can do. But in many ways, and in many circumstances, I've seen that be the best thing for corporate morale, frankly, is to walk away from business that it hurts it's to one direction. You know what I mean? Like oftentimes that asymmetrical relationship where there's too much power on one side over another, that's never a healthy relationship, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or a supplier relationship. It should be a marriage of equals in terms of compensation, delivery, and execution.
Yeah. Oh, and it is a mutually beneficial situation. And I love the idea of really deeply knowing your clients and knowing their objectives and their requirements and being able to act in a strategic consultative approach, right? So that you can help them with the options to success.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I want one final point. I think that's really, really a great way to hold your partners accountable. One of the things that I think is a problem with a lot of very mature programs is the unwillingness, or kind of the tendency of these programs to stick to a status quo, right? Meanwhile, the universe of work, and the universe of contingent work specifically, is evolving with thousands and new providers and tools and technologies and artificial intelligence and the RPA and everything. Really making the basis of your relationship about holding each other accountable to explore these new options. That is to me such a missing element of almost any program that I've ever talked to. They focus on the traditional timeline, right? We're going to get our agency spend. We're going to consolidate suppliers. We're going to focus on SOW. Then we're going to go to global expansion. Then we'll talk about the notion of TTM. Well, those are all 5 different things that are certainly valid and things that need to be incorporated in some way, shape, or form. But there's thousands of talent marketplaces, internship structures, direct sourcing using different, all these other things that are often missed in the normal conversation. And I know, a lot of people just get used to the same thing, and then the relationship becomes stale, and they start saying, "What have you brought to me lately?" So building that in, understanding how innovation is going to play into long-term strategy of your program, and making sure you work collaboratively with your providers to hold them accountable as well, to bring you those innovative solutions, and having that incorporated, I think that's really one of the key final missing elements to success. Holding everyone accountable, willing to say no, understanding where your business fits in the overall profile of your supplier in relation to other clients. And finally, really focusing on a relationship that's built on long-term improvement, and that improvement must include innovation. So that's the best way to keep your program from going stale and keep your career from getting boring.
Unbelievable advice. So once again, Bryan, thank you for joining us on this rainy Saturday from California, and look forward to seeing you on the circuit and out there helping clients with your Defiant solutions.